Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to KWN Network. We've been talking over the past 4 or so Saturdays on the subject of covenants. Today we are continuing with that particular subject, and today we are talking about the protocols of covenant. Thank you for joining me this Saturday morning. We are here every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock and every Tuesday at 9 in the morning on Tuesdays. And on Tuesdays we talk business issues, and on Saturday we talk things such as protocols and covenants and other things like that. KWN Network is about training and equipping in matters of leadership, matters of business, giftedness, and purpose. I pray that our broadcast is helping somebody. Thank you for joining me this morning. Today we are talking about the protocols of covenant. We have done the hierarchy of covenant. We've done your personal covenant with God. We've done the signs and symbols of covenant. Today we are doing the protocols of covenant. Prayerfully we will be able to finish it today, and therefore that would be today should be our last presentation on covenants if we are able to move quickly on time. So what is a protocol? Ladies and gentlemen, a protocol, according to some dictionaries, is a system of rules that explain the correct conduct and procedure to be followed in a formal situation. Another one says it's an official procedure or system of rules governing affairs, whether in state, diplomacy, legal, as the case may be. Another one says it's a standard set of rules that allow certain things to happen. In other words, protocols are about the proper way of dealing with things. The proper way to deal with a president, a queen, a king, a diplomat, a proper way to deal with a spouse, a proper way to deal with a chief executive, a proper way to deal with an issue or a matter. The Bible puts it in Ecclesiastes 8 verse number 6, say there is a proper time and procedure for every matter. In other words, things must not be done haphazardly. They must be done according to their proper procedure or proper way. So in the context then of covenants, we are saying that there is a proper way then of dealing with covenantal issues. You don't deal with covenantal issues any odd how. You wake up today, you're doing it this way. You wake up tomorrow, you're doing it that way. Because in doing so, breach and other problems will come. And we will demonstrate that in a moment. Some of our anchor scriptures in what we're going to be talking about today, but we may not have the time to delve into them deeply, would be Genesis 9 verses 12 through 17, Genesis 17, the whole chapter. Read that please in your own time. That's a very important chapter where covenants are concerned, where God showed up and spoke to Abraham and Sarah about who they were and who they were becoming and what was going to be happening over their lives and the lives of their children over generations, because Abraham is the one guy whose generational covenant stretches till today. So that's very, very, very important. We are going to talk about some protocols. Some of them we're just going to shoot through for the sake of time. Genesis 3 verse 9, 12 through 17 says, "And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. And I set the rainbow in the clouds, and it shall be for you a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters will never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it, and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh in the earth. And the Lord said to Noah, this is a sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh in the earth." So, what are the protocols of a covenant? What do you do with a covenant? How do you behave? How do you treat your covenant? How do you handle your covenant? We're just going to shoot through these, so we'll just call it number one. Number one, you must recognize that your covenant comes with obligations upon you which you must fulfill. So there are rights and obligations to every covenant. Number one, you must perform those obligations and obviously harvest the benefits from it. Number two, covenant is about faith. Faith, as it is written concerning Abraham, that Abraham believed the Lord when the Lord said to him, I'll do this, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. Number 3, faithfulness. You must be faithful to the covenant that you have entered, or covenants you have entered. In other words, you can't be in this covenant and you are flirting with a competing, contradicting, or opposing covenant. Simple example, marriage. If you are in this marriage, that's where you stay. You can't be competing with another or flirting with another relationship or another covenant elsewhere, because you are supposed to be faithful in this one. Number 4 or something. Covenants generally are lifetime. Some are not. As we said in the hierarchy of covenants, some covenants are actually fulfilled. What was promised happens. What was covenanted gets achieved. So it's possible that a covenant can actually be fulfilled. But generally, covenants are for a lifetime. Next point is that covenants are usually sacrificial. They are sacrificial in that they require you to pay a price for that covenant, because in the obligations you must perform, if it particularly covenants between God and man, God requires certain things of us which normally indicate our obedience to him. In other words, like with Abraham in Genesis chapter number 17, he says to me, walk before me. In other words, you can't walk before God loaded with your sin, with your witchcraft, with your ngangas and whatever. You can't walk before God in that fashion. It's something we will preach soon enough. So walking before God demands that you can walk before him uprightly, righteously, without having to be ashamed or having to wonder about your sin and so on and so on. Walking before God demands certain things. So usually most covenants have a sacrificial component to them, where you are required to give something. And in most instances with God, the primary thing he requires of us in covenant is obedience. So your covenant is good, it's okay, it's all good if you are being obedient. We see this throughout the history of Israel. Whenever they were not obedient, they got into trouble. But when they were obedient, things flowed smoothly. Things went very well for them. Like if you look at Joshua, Joshua was obedient. We have no record of sin on the part of Joshua. He made one mistake, which we'll talk about a little later on. But Joshua was all upright. And if you look at how Joshua's journey went from being Moses' assistant to Joshua 1 when he took over the leadership of the nation and carried on running the nation, got them their possession, it was doable. It was, call it easy in quotes, because there was obedience there. We have on record, we'll talk about one of them, in my own opinion, 2 mistakes that Joshua made, and one of them we'll talk about in some detail today. Next point is that any covenant has a requirement of give and take. You receive, but you also give. Whether you are giving in your obedience or you are giving in your love in a marriage covenant, but you also receive. That's why it's critical in a marriage that you are more concerned about giving than receiving. So what happens in a marriage is that when you are doing more to give, you are, whether you are the husband or the wife, so I must be concerned about giving to my wife more than I am about receiving. Why is that important? Because she's doing the same. She's more concerned about giving to me than from receiving to me. And when we are doing that, everybody is giving or is driven by giving, not receiving. In other words, selfless, not selfish. What happens then is everybody gets what they want and what they need. So it's about give and take, but usually the focus is you focus on giving, not on taking. When you focus on taking, you are being selfish, generally. When you focus on giving, then you are generous and you are giving and you are sowing a seed which enables you then to receive. So it's a give and take arrangement. Like we said, covenants are generally generational. And particularly, okay, let's look at this one, Genesis 6 verse 18 and 19. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you and your sons' wives, your own wife, with you, and so on and so on. In other words, God is saying here to Noah that his covenant is with him specifically and those who are with him. So it's not just about him. Yes, it's personal to him, but it's also for his generations. What we also understand here from his wife, his sons, and their 3 wives, from which the rest of humanity has since come, is that God required, and we see this with Abraham particularly, that you teach your children concerning your covenantal arrangements with God. In other words, I have a duty to teach my son about Christ. I have a duty to teach my daughter about Christ. It's not just about me and they can do whatever it is they want. No, it's about generations, because God is generational and he is relational. Next point is that you must remember your covenant. Some of us have covenants with God that we have packed far in the back of our minds. We don't remember, we don't act on them, we've just forgotten them. They are not important, they are not significant. In fact, the opposite should be true. Your covenant with God should drive your daily life and what you do, who you are, and everything, because it's everything. That covenant with God, from it emanates everything. You might think or imagine. Exodus 2, verse number 24. So God heard their groanings, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God was reminded when Israel was groaning in Egypt. He was reminded of his covenant with Jacob, with Isaac, and with Abraham. And he moved to act on that covenant because they had abandoned God or whatever had happened. And God was reminded because they were in pain. So you must remember your covenant. It should be in the forefront of your mind. Genesis 17, verse number 4. My covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of many nations. This is God speaking to Abraham. In other words, it's a personal covenant. It's not with 100 people. In this instance, the reference is to Lot, who had gone with him, who had traveled with him. Yes, it's important in life. You will walk with many, many other people. But remember that your covenant is for you, not necessarily for Lot. Lot must have his own covenant with God. So if Lot needs to separate with you so that he can pursue his covenant with God, you should be good with it, because you are pursuing your own covenant with God. Don't get so mingled up with friends, with your buddies, with your ladies, with your girlfriends, that you forget your own covenant with God and you are chasing your best friend's covenant. No, you chase your covenant and you help others and you walk with others as they chase their covenant. For example, I'm serving Bishop Bismarck with pleasure and gladly, and I'm doing whatever it is in terms of my part to participate in whatever God is doing in Bishop's life from the perspective of New Life Covenant Church and so on and so on. I gladly do so. But I also realize that I have my own covenant with God, which I pursue every day. So I'm running with both. I do not forget my own covenant with God. It is not for 100 people, except those in your genealogy or in your generations. It is personal with you. That's why last week we were talking about the week before, we were talking about your personal covenant with God. Let's take an example of a marriage and look at how covenants occur, or what the marriage covenant is about, and what we can draw from it in terms of all covenants. Genesis 2, verse number 23 and 25. This is Adam and Eve's wedding. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she has been taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And they were both naked, the man and his wife, so they are now married, and were not ashamed. Ephesians 5, verses 22 to 33. I'm going to jump all over here, but read the whole thing for yourself. Verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands as unto the Lord. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. 28, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. So, what do we draw from these? Let's start maybe with the Genesis part. So there is the living and the cleaving part. We spoke about that last week. You can get that in our broadcast last week. Number 2, there's the one flesh aspect. Number 3, there is an aspect that says you are not your own. Paul talks about this, that wives and husbands, you're not your own, you belong to each other. In other words, in terms of conjugal issues, for example, a wife can't say, a husband can't say, I don't want or whatever it is to make love to my husband, because you owe each other those conjugal rights, as we might call them. So there's an aspect that you are not your own. Of course, we are not promoting anything that's improper, such as rape in marriage, forcing a woman because you belong to me. No, that is wrong. It's rape. It's very, very simple. But in a willing marriage relationship, a husband should give himself to his wife and the wife to her husband. You honor each other in a marriage relationship. How does this translate to others? You honor, to other covenantal arrangement. You honor your covenantal arrangements, your covenantal relationship with God. You prefer each other ahead of yourself. In other words, whatever covenant I might have, like I said earlier on with my wife, I must prefer my wife ahead of myself. I must prefer my God ahead of myself. God prefers us. He actually does so much to prefer us. That's why he gave Christ, he gave his only begotten son. In a marriage arrangement, selflessness must get out, and we must be, selfishness must not be, but selflessness must be how we deal with each other, selflessly preferring the other. We must, in our marriage arrangements, our marriage covenants, we must be sacrificial. We must pay the price of love. What does that mean? Husbands, love your wives. Verse 25, Ephesians 5. Just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. In other words, Christ died for the church. If you read the next verses there, it explains why and how. We don't have time to do that this morning. But Christ died for the church. That's how much he sacrificed for her. Husbands, submit to your own wives, submit to your own husbands. Why is that important? Or what are we saying? It's not just that the wife is submitting to a husband, but the wife is submitting to the covenant, which in the partnership of covenant in the marriage, it's typified in the husband. So the submission, it's more to submit to the covenant, to say, my covenant requires this of me, and I'm submitting to it. Why is submission okay in a marriage? It's not so that you are a doormat or you are a carpet on which a husband trembles. No, it's very clear here. Verse 22, husbands, submit to your own wives, submit to your own husbands, as to the Lord. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. So there is no abuse of submission in a marriage relationship because that husband loves sacrificially. You don't love someone sacrificially and beat them up every day. You don't love someone sacrificially and abuse them every day. That is not so. So if both parties are doing their part in the covenant, submission does not become a problem. It does not become abusive or whatever. It is honoring the covenant that you have. I hope that makes clear. Let me move on for the sake of time and jump on to our case study this morning, which is Joshua chapter 9, verses 1 through 18. Very long reading, so I'm just going to jump again over the particular points that I would like to highlight, but please read it in detail on your own. And it came to pass when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, in the hills and in the lowland and on the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites, and the Jebusites, the Hites, heard about it, that they gathered together to fight Joshua and Israel with one accord. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon, a city, heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors, and they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins, torn and mended. In other words, they masked who they really were. They heard what had happened. They heard what God was doing through Joshua, how Jericho's walls had fallen apart, how Ai had been taken over by the Israelites. And these guys were crafty. They made a plot, they made a plan, and they pretended. They went and they pretended it said. They took old things, old sex, old clothes, and they made it look as though they were coming from a very, very long distance. They took old bread, which was moldy and dry, not fresh. And they went to Joshua verse 6 at the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, "We have come from a far country, now make a covenant with us." Just like that. Then the men of Israel said to the Havites, "Perhaps you dwell among us, so how can we make a covenant with you?" And they said to Joshua, "We are your servants. Be careful of people who come to you quickly offering to be your servant. What are they after?" And Joshua said to them, "Who are you and where do you come from?" In other words, Joshua is now beginning a process of due diligence to investigate who is this person who wants to enter into contract with me or into covenant with me. Who are they? What do they want? Who is this young man who's saying, "I like you, I love you," or can I take you on a date? Can I have coffee with you? Can I take you to dinner? Who is he? Who are you? Where do you come from? These questions were not as simple as geographical to say, where do you come from, or who are you, to say what is your name. No, these were due diligence issues. Who are you goes deeper than what is your name. Where do you come from goes deeper than what is your geography. So do your due diligence. So they said to him, "From a very far country," which was a lie. That's verse number 9. Then let's jump maybe to verse number 10 somewhere. Take provision. Verse 11. Therefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, "Take provisions with you for the journey and go to meet them, to meet the children of Israel, and say to them, we are your servants. Now therefore make a covenant with us." Verse number 14. Then the men of Israel took some of their provisions. Be careful whose provisions you take. But they did not take counsel, or they did not ask counsel of the Lord. That was Joshua's mistake. They took the provisions of these people, what they offered them, but they did not seek the counsel of the Lord. He goes on to say in verse number 15, "So Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them leave. And the rulers of the congregation swore to them." So Joshua and the leaders of Israel swore to the Gibeonites that they would not kill them like they were killing everybody else, or were supposed to kill everyone else in the land of the promise. They made a covenant to spare the people of Gibeon. They did some due diligence, but they were lied to. What they did not do is they did not seek the counsel of the Lord before they entered this covenant. Verse 16, "And it happened at the end of all of 3 days, just 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors who dwelt near them." They were their next door neighbors, 2 houses down the road, and you've made a covenant with them on the assumption that they came from far. Then the children of Israel journeyed and came to their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Beeroth, and so on and so on. But the children of Israel did not attack them, because the rulers of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord. So, what is this saying? Joshua has now discovered that they were cheated into a covenant. Cheated, straight up cheated. These guys lied. Did Joshua stay in the covenant? Yes. We need to be careful what covenants we enter, because they had sworn by the Lord. They couldn't now kill these guys because they had made a covenant with them. That's why you must do a proper due diligence, number 1. Number 2, and more importantly, that's why you must inquire of the Lord and make sure that the Lord gives you a go-ahead before you do anything that's even remotely covenantal, that's even remotely long-term in its texture. If it is just sitting down for a cup of tea to hear some guy who wants to pitch an idea to you, fine. But to then go on and invite him and enter a covenant with him, you must do the right thing. Do your due diligence. Number 2, inquire of the Lord and get the Lord's go ahead. Joshua didn't do that. We then read in the days of King David in 2 Samuel 21 verses 1 through 6. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And what did David do? It says, and David inquired of the Lord. That was one of David's uniquenesses and why God loved David. He inquired of the Lord. Even that time when his family was taken, when they'd gone to war this side and the enemy came from that side and took their families, he inquired of the Lord, should I pursue? Will I overtake them? David constantly inquired of the Lord. The Lord answered David and said, it is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. So the Lord is saying to David, the Gibeonites and Joshua made a covenant, and the Gibeonites are not supposed to be killed. They are supposed to be allowed to live peacefully among the Israelites. There will be carriers of water, hewers of wood, whatever, but they are to live in peace in your midst. But Saul, in his zeal for the people of the Lord, he killed the Gibeonites. As a result, there was a famine in the land for 3 successive years. This is the Lord himself saying, it is because of Saul, his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not the children of Israel, but the remnants of the Amorites. And the children of Israel had sworn protection to them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and for Judah. Verse number 3, therefore David called the Gibeonites and said, what shall I do for you? And with what shall I make an atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord, which is Israel? In other words, David is saying Gibeon has been wronged because Saul killed Gibeonites. David is now saying, what can I do for you to compensate you for what King Saul, my predecessor, did? That's why if you are a king or you succeed a chief executive or senior pastor, you should honor his commitments. You can't come in Donald Trump as the new president of the United States and say everything Barack Obama did, what money he borrowed, you're not going to pay it. No. These obligations carry on from one generation to the next. That's why covenants are generally said to be generational. They don't care who you are. How many generations were there between Joshua and David? There were many generations. But this covenant still existed, and God recognized it as such. And he says the reason why there's a famine in the land is because Saul killed Gibeonites, who Israel swore not to kill in the days of Joshua. And David now had to make recompense to the Gibeonites on account of what Saul had done, killing Gibeonites, whom Joshua had entered into a covenant with. So he says, what shall I do for you? How shall I make atonement so that you can bless the inheritance of the Lord? David seems to be saying right here that the blessing of the Gibeonites, who cheated them generations ago, that they might bless them, because guess what, there was a famine. And David here seems to be saying that the Gibeonites, with whom they were in covenant, even if it was not in the forefront of David's mind, that they were actually holding a blessing for Israel. That's how serious this is. That you may bless the inheritance of the Lord. Then the Gibeonites were then given 7 of the sons of Saul, whom they hung in compensation or whatever it was that we might call it. And then in verse 14, we read, they buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan, his son, in the country of Benjamin, in Zillah, and in the tomb of Kish, his father. And so they performed what the king had commanded. And after that, God heeded the prayer for the land. In other words, the land of Israel was only healed after David did something to recognize and to honor the covenant Joshua made with the Gibeonites. Covenants are important, ladies and gentlemen. As I conclude this series on covenants, I want you to realize that you cannot mess about with covenants that you have made, whether it's your marriage covenant, business covenants, national covenants. Zimbabwe has made many covenants or undertakings with different people. If you borrow from the IMF, that's a covenant, pay it. I'm glad that the government of Zimbabwe is seeking to do so. It's important that we do these things because covenants hold so much. I wonder, is it possible that the famine we might be seeing, say in Zimbabwe or wherever you are, might be because somebody somewhere broke a covenant? Somebody somewhere didn't do the right things that had been covenanted, whether by themselves or generations before them. We must honor the covenants that we have made, and sometimes even the covenants that we have inherited. Some of these covenants are uncomfortable. What do you do with them? Seek to fulfill them. Because covenants can be fulfilled. Approach the other party and say, look, this covenant is no longer working for us. Can we pay you off? Can we buy ourselves out of this covenant or something, rather than break them or ignore them? There was a season Zimbabwe was not honoring its obligations to the IMF, World Bank, and so on in the previous dispensation of government in this country. And we suffered for it. Because you can't borrow. The laws of wealth don't allow you to borrow, not pay back, refuse to pay back, refuse to honor your obligations, and you prosper. It doesn't work like that. And we're going to be dealing with that, I think, possibly even on Tuesday, concerning that very issue that was possibly our subject on Tuesday. You can't do that because then you are holding yourself back, or to be accurate, you are bringing a famine into your own land. So seek to do right by the covenants you have made. If you've done wrong, correct your wrongs, in whichever way you may need to correct those wrongs. In this instance, David allowed the Gibeonites, let me call it vengeance. They were allowed to hang Saul's sons in compensation for Saul killing them. Saul almost wiped them out. If you need to go and pay whoever you might owe with interest, don't hide, don't pretend you don't owe the money. Pay it up. If you've done wrong in a relationship, make it right. Apologize where you need to, and work that covenant as you should. Why? Because that covenant is going to hold you up one way or another. So let me ask you this. What is your covenant with God? In a previous session, we spoke about our personal covenants with God. How are we doing on that covenant? If you've misstepped, it's not too late to correct your course and come back right. Come back into the right lane so that you are compliant with and you are walking in terms of your covenant. Maybe you've forgotten your covenant. Remember your covenant, because the Lord is always remembering his covenant, and the Lord put signs to remind him of his covenant with us, such as the rainbow. It's a reminder to God. Such as circumcision, it's a reminder to man of the covenant we have with God. Your covenant with God is the most important thing you have. Your covenant with others are critically important. Your marriage, it's more than a relationship. It's more than a contract. It's more than I like her today, not tomorrow. It is a covenant, and you should treat it and honor it as such. I think we'll stop there and conclude our series on covenants today. Come, let me pray for you. So, Father, this morning I pray for my brother, my sister. I pray, Lord, that you help us. Definitely, we might have misstepped here or there in our covenants. We might not have said the right things or done the right things, or we have dishonored, if it's a company or at national level or church level or institutional level, we have dishonored covenants that were made by our predecessors that we should be honoring. We have dishonored our covenantal relationships with our employees, with our employers, whom we have stolen from, or we've done some wrong in that arrangement. Today, Lord, I ask for forgiveness, that you would forgive us and allow us to correct our course and come back on line of covenant, that we might honor you and honor those covenants, because when we honor covenants, we are honoring God. Lord, I'm praying now, not only for forgiveness, but I'm also praying for restoration. So many times Israel violated their covenant with you, and you've recorded in your word that they went and prostituted with other gods. They went and had relationships that they shouldn't have had, swearing covenants that they shouldn't have, honoring gods that they shouldn't have, that were idols, and abandoning you. And so many times they were taken into captivity. They were punished or whatever for what they had done. I'm praying, Lord, for your grace, that where we have violated covenant, or our covenant with you, or covenant with others, that you would forgive us, Lord, that you would deal with us in your mercy, in your gentleness, in your love, and in your kindness, not in your harshness and in your wrath, my God, but that you would deal with us gently, kindly, as you love us, as Christ loves his church. Bring us back into fold, bring us back into covenant in your gentleness, my God, I pray. And give us yet another opportunity, I ask, to do the right things by the covenants we are obliged to honor. We are obliged to do the right things by. And that, Father, when that is done, we want to walk aright. We want to walk in the way of those covenants, in the ways of honoring our covenants. And that, my God, from them, we would be honored back. We would be given back, Jehovah God, in terms of the rights we might have in those covenants, whether it is a marriage covenant or a business covenant of some sort. I pray, Lord, in the name of Jesus, especially for Africa, that you help us where this is concerned, that you help us, Lord, to do the right things in honoring our covenant with you. We love you, Lord, and I know that the day of our restoration is upon us. I thank you, Lord, for your grace and your mercy. Forgive our sins. Restore us, restore our covenants, restore your favor to us, O God, in the name of Jesus and for his glory alone. Amen. I'll see you on Tuesday. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in. I pray this has blessed you. I pray that you have been alerted to the things you needed to learn. I'll see you on Tuesday. Remember, wisdom is the principal thing. God bless you.